The late afternoon sun cast long, golden shadows across the dusty trail that wound through the outskirts of a small western town. The air was thick with the scent of dry earth, horse sweat, and the faint tang of wood smoke from nearby cabins. A lone cowboy rode steadily along the path, his hat pulled low to shield his eyes from the sun, boots scuffed from years on the trail, and a coat worn thin at the elbows. He had traveled this way many times, and the quiet solitude had become his companion, sometimes comforting, sometimes painfully lonely. Today he expected nothing more than the wind in his ears and the rhythmic sound of his horse's hooves on the hard-packed dirt. Then, without warning, a small voice broke the stillness. "Can you buy us, mister?" The words were barely louder than a whisper, yet they carried an urgency that made him halt instantly. He squinted toward the source and saw a little girl standing at the edge of the trail. She clutched a baby in her arms with the fierce protectiveness of someone much older than her years. Her dress was patched and worn, dust clinging to the fabric like it had become part of her. Her bare feet left faint impressions in the dirt, and her wide, dark eyes stared at him with a mixture of hope and fear. The cowboy's first reaction was shock. He was no stranger to the hardships of frontier life, yet this request was unlike anything he had ever encountered. "Buy us?" he repeated quietly, his voice catching slightly. I don't understand, little lady. What do you mean?" The girl's eyes flickered toward the baby, then back to him. She shook her head slightly, too young to articulate the complexities of her situation. Her lips trembled as she whispered, We have nowhere to go, please." He studied her closely, noting the dirt under her fingernails, the hollow look in her cheeks, and the way she hugged the baby so tightly as if shielding it from the world. The innocence of her face clashed violently with the reality he could sense behind her eyes: loss, desperation, and fear. It was clear she had been left alone, forced to survive without adult protection, carrying the weight of responsibility for another small life. The cowboy felt a pang deep in his chest, a rare stir of emotion he hadn't felt in years of isolation. For a long moment, he simply looked at her. The world seemed to shrink to just the three of them, the girl, the baby, and himself. The wind rustled the dry leaves at their feet, carrying the faint jingling of his horse's harness, but beyond that, there was only silence. He realized that the trail he had ridden countless times, once familiar and predictable, now felt different. It felt like a threshold between the life he had known and the unknown responsibility that had suddenly landed in front of him. The girl's grip on the baby tightened. "Please, mister," she said, voice trembling. He noticed how tiny and fragile the baby seemed, sleeping with one hand curled against its small chest, completely dependent on the girl. The sight struck something primal in the cowboy, a protective instinct that was long dormant, buried under years of solitude and survival in the harsh frontier. He shifted in his saddle, unsure of what to do. His mind raced through practicalities. He had limited supplies, his cabin was small, and he had lived all this time alone, away from attachments that might complicate his life, and yet none of that mattered. The girl's eyes, so full of trust and desperation, cut through every hesitation. In that moment, the cowboy knew he couldn't walk away. He couldn't leave them to face the world alone, no matter how unprepared he might feel. With a slow exhale, he nodded slightly. "All right," he said softly, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his chest. "Let's get you somewhere safe." The girl's face lit up with relief, and the baby stirred, sensing the shift in the girl's tension. Together, they began walking toward the cowboy's horse, and a quiet understanding passed between them, a fragile connection born in an unexpected encounter, the first step toward a journey that would change all of their lives. After leading the girl and the baby away from the dusty trail, the cowboy guided them toward a small, shaded grove where he often rested during his long rides. The horse stamped its hooves nervously, sensing the tension in the air, while the girl shifted the baby slightly in her arms, rocking it gently. For a moment, no one spoke. The cowboy watched them closely, trying to piece together the fragments of their situation from the little he could see. The girl's clothes were worn and faded, stitched repeatedly in a patchwork of survival. The baby's blanket was nothing more than a thin scrap of cloth, fraying at the edges, barely enough to shield it from the chill of the late afternoon. Even from a distance, the marks of hardship were evident: sunburned skin, chapped lips, and the dirt ingrained into their hair. The cowboy, who had spent years on the trail, had seen countless signs of struggle, but the sight of these two children alone struck him with an immediacy that made his chest tighten. Finally, the girl spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. We don't have anyone," she said, glancing down at the baby as if to shield it from the world's harsh gaze. Her words were simple, but the weight behind them was immense. The cowboy could sense the layers of pain and neglect she had endured, each word carrying the unspoken history of nights spent hungry, cold, and afraid. He asked gently, "What happened? Where are your folks?" She hesitated, eyes darting nervously toward the horizon as though expecting someone or something to appear. They left," she murmured finally, her voice breaking. "Mama went away. Papa, I don't know. They left us alone." She tightened her hold on the baby, whose small hand rested against her chest, and he could feel the subtle trembling of both child and infant. I tried to take care of him," she said, nodding toward the baby, "but I couldn't. Not always." Her confession was raw, unfiltered, and it pierced through the cowboy's usual stoic exterior. He realized she had been forced to grow up too quickly, carrying a burden no child should bear. The cowboy scanned the nearby landscape as he listened. He noticed footprints in the dirt that didn't belong to them, evidence of others who might have passed through recently. Perhaps neighbors, perhaps strangers, or perhaps the very people who had abandoned them. The girl had learned early to be wary, to protect herself and the baby at all costs. He could see it in the way she held her body, how her eyes darted toward every movement in the brush. She had learned that caution was survival. For the first time, she allowed herself to relax slightly in his presence, though it was tentative. She explained in halting sentences that she had been wandering from town to town, scavenging food and seeking shelter wherever she could find it. Nights had been spent under bridges or in empty barns, the baby wrapped as best she could in whatever cloth she could gather. Hunger had been constant, the cold relentless, and the loneliness unbearable. Yet despite everything, there was a quiet determination in her voice, a spark that refused to be extinguished. The cowboy's heart ached as he listened. He understood the courage it had taken for her to survive, but he also saw the toll it had taken on her innocence. This was no ordinary child. She was a young guardian, carrying responsibilities that belonged to grown adults. Her eyes, though wary, held a depth of resilience that fascinated and unsettled him. He felt a swelling need to protect her and the baby, to provide them with the security and care they had been denied. As the sun began to dip lower behind the hills, casting long shadows across the grove, the cowboy made a silent vow. These two children, though vulnerable, were not alone anymore. He would shelter them, feed them, and safeguard them from the dangers of a world that had already been cruel enough. In that quiet moment, as the wind rustled the dry leaves and the baby stirred in the girl's arms, the cowboy sat on a fallen log at the edge of the grove, his hat tipped low and his hands resting on his knees. He watched the little girl adjust the baby in her arms, humming softly to calm it. The soft tune was fragile and uncertain, yet it carried a strength that surprised him. He could see the exhaustion etched into her small frame, the tension in her shoulders, the dirt ingrained in her hair, the way she blinked rapidly to keep tears from falling. He wanted to reach out, to take her hand and say it would all be okay, but a part of him hesitated. He had lived alone for years, finding comfort in solitude and routine. His cabin, his horse, and the endless expanse of prairie had been all he needed. Responsibility had always been a distant concept, something he respected in others but never felt himself equipped to handle. Now, confronted with the girl's pleading eyes and the helpless baby, he felt an unfamiliar weight pressing on his chest. The question she had asked on the trail, "Can you buy us, mister?" echoed in his mind, heavy with expectation and need. The practical side of him immediately sprang into action, cataloging every obstacle. He had limited supplies, just enough food and water for himself for a few days, a small stove for cooking, and a lonesome cabin that had never been prepared for guests. Could he provide warmth for two? Could he keep them safe from the dangers of the frontier, the unpredictable weather, the wildlife, or the less than honest people who roamed the land? Every logical instinct told him to turn them away, to keep walking, to maintain the life he had built for himself. And yet, his heart argued differently. He noticed the little girl's unwavering gaze, the trust she placed in him despite knowing him for only a few moments. Her grip on the baby was fierce, protective, and vulnerable all at once, showing him the fragile courage of someone forced to face hardships far beyond their years. He thought of the nights he had spent alone, feeling the gnawing ache of isolation. Suddenly, the idea of turning them away felt cruel, an act that would haunt him far longer than the difficulties of helping them ever could. He rose slowly and circled the girl and the baby, scanning the horizon for anyone who might appear, anyone who might claim them or threaten their safety. The world was unpredictable, harsh, and unforgiving, but he could not ignore the silent plea in the girl's eyes. She had no one else to depend on. The baby, small and fragile, stirred in her arms, its tiny fingers curling around her thumb. The cowboy's chest tightened further. He understood in that instant that he had a choice: continue his solitary life or step into a role he had never imagined, protector, guardian, and perhaps something even deeper. For a long moment, he weighed the consequences. He remembered the lessons life had taught him on the trail, the importance of preparation, caution, and self-preservation. And then he looked at them again, the girl, with her resilient spirit, and the baby, so innocent and dependent. Something shifted inside him, a rare clarity that was both frightening and liberating. He realized that helping them would not only save them, but might also bring a kind of purpose and connection he had long denied himself. Finally, he exhaled slowly, tipping his hat back to reveal a face lined with years of solitude and hard choices. "All right," he said, voice low but steady, carrying both determination and reassurance. "We'll figure this out, together." The girl's eyes widened, a mixture of relief and disbelief, and the baby gurgled softly, sensing the warmth and protection emanating from the cowboy. At that moment, the cowboy knew that his life had changed forever. The hesitation had passed, replaced by a commitment he had never anticipated. He had no roadmap, no certainty of the future, but he had made the choice to take responsibility, to face hardship alongside these two fragile lives. And in doing so, he discovered that even in the harsh, lonely expanse of the frontier, compassion and connection could carve a path toward hope. The cowboy led the little girl and the baby through a narrow path that cut between low hills, the prairies stretching endlessly around them, bathed in the golden glow of late afternoon. He walked slowly, matching the girl's tentative steps, while the baby nestled against her chest, occasionally stirring and letting out small, soft cries. The air was dry, and the wind carried the faint scent of sagebrush and distant wood smoke. For the first time in a long while, the cowboy felt the quiet hum of responsibility settle over him, a feeling both foreign and strangely comforting. As they approached his small cabin tucked at the edge of a grove of trees, the girl's eyes widened. The cabin was modest, weathered wood, a small porch with a swinging lantern, and smoke curling lazily from the chimney. From a distance, it might have seemed lonely and uninviting, but to the girl, it represented safety, warmth, and a reprieve from the harsh world she had known. She clutched the baby tighter, almost as if to confirm to herself that this sanctuary was real and not another fleeting mirage. Once inside, the cowboy guided her to a small, worn rug by the fireplace and encouraged her to sit. The cabin smelled faintly of wood smoke and leather, and the soft light of the lantern cast gentle shadows across the room. He removed his hat, running a hand through his hair, and watched as the girl eased the baby into a makeshift cradle, a sturdy basket lined with a few scraps of cloth. She looked up at him hesitantly, as if expecting him to change his mind, and he offered a reassuring nod. "Here," he said, pointing to a small pot on the stove. "We can make something warm to eat. It's not much, but it'll keep you strong." The girl's lips quivered, and she nodded, her eyes brimming with gratitude. The baby stirred in her arms, and she whispered soothing words, her voice carrying both relief and lingering fear. In that moment, the cowboy realized that the girl was not only caring for the baby, but also for him in a subtle way. Her trust and willingness to accept his help demanded his own careful attention. As they settled into the cabin, the girl began to speak in hesitant, fragmented sentences. She told him about the days spent wandering from town to town, scavenging scraps of food, sleeping in barns, and avoiding the eyes of people who might exploit or harm her. The cowboy listened silently, occasionally nodding, never interrupting. Her story was raw and unpolished, filled with fear, determination, and glimpses of courage he hadn't anticipated from someone so young. He could see the weight she had carried alone and felt an urgent need to lighten it, even if only slightly. The cowboy busied himself with the fire, fetching water from a nearby jug and preparing a small meal. He watched the girl's careful attention to the baby, noting how she rocked it gently, hummed to it, and whispered soft encouragements. It was a delicate dance of survival and tenderness, and he felt a profound respect for her resilience. In that quiet, shared domesticity, a fragile bond began to form. He realized that trust was taking root, one small act at a time. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, carrying the sounds of the prairie, the distant call of a hawk, the whisper of the grass. Inside, there was warmth, quiet, and a tentative sense of safety. The cowboy understood that this was only a temporary shelter, a stop on a longer journey. Yet it was enough to begin rebuilding a sense of security for the girl and the baby, and in turn, it began to transform him. By the time evening fell, the little girl's shoulders had relaxed slightly, and the baby had drifted into a peaceful sleep. The cowboy poured himself a cup of water, sat quietly near the fire, and reflected on the strange twist of fate that had brought them together. He had offered them a temporary refuge, but it was becoming clear that this encounter was not temporary for him. His life had shifted irrevocably, and for the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose beyond himself, an understanding that protecting and nurturing these two fragile lives could bring meaning he had long thought lost. The days that followed at the cowboy's cabin were quiet but filled with small, meaningful moments that slowly began to weave a fragile sense of trust between the three of them. The little girl remained cautious, her eyes constantly scanning for threats. Yet the safety of the cabin allowed her to let down some of her defenses. She had spent so long fending for herself and the baby that the idea of someone else caring for them seemed almost impossible to accept. Still, the cowboy's steady presence, quiet patience, and gentle gestures spoke louder than any words could. Each morning, the cowboy would rise with the sun, stoking the fire and preparing a modest breakfast. He watched the girl as she carefully tended to the baby, washing its small face with a damp cloth. brushing its hair with a few wisps of gentle fingers, and humming soft tunes that reminded him of a lullaby he hadn't heard in decades. He noticed how her voice softened when she spoke to the baby, how her whole posture shifted from tension to tenderness. It was a glimpse of her true self, one hidden beneath layers of survival instinct and fear, and it moved him profoundly. The cowboy made small efforts to reach her emotionally, speaking little at first, letting his actions show care rather than his words. He would fetch extra blankets for the baby at night, repair the girl's torn clothing, or leave small treats where she could find them. Slowly, these gestures began to chip away at the wall of wariness she had built. One day, she finally looked at him and said, "Thank you, mister," her voice quiet but genuine. It was a small acknowledgement, but to him, it carried enormous weight. Trust, he realized, was being extended to him in increments, fragile and deliberate, and he resolved to honor it. The baby, sensing the girl's relaxation, began to respond more readily to the cowboy as well. When he hummed a tune by the fire or offered a soft hand to touch, the baby would coo or grasp his finger with tiny strength. This small, wordless interaction delighted him, bringing an unexpected joy he hadn't felt in years. He realized that this tiny, fragile life depended not only on the girl but also on him, and the realization awakened a deep sense of responsibility and protectiveness. Over the next few days, the cabin became a place of quiet healing. The cowboy would sit and teach the girl small survival skills, not out of necessity, but as a way of showing her she was capable, that she had strength she could trust. She learned to start a fire safely, care for the horse, and prepare simple meals. Each new skill she mastered gave her a sense of pride, and with it, a growing comfort in relying on someone else for guidance. In return, he began to share stories of his own life in fragments daily of hardship, loneliness, and the occasional fleeting joy. These shared moments, though modest, formed the first threads of connection between them. One evening, after the baby had fallen asleep in the little cradle and the sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, the girl finally allowed herself to lean against the cowboy's side. It was a tentative gesture, almost shy, but it spoke volumes. She no longer felt the need to remain constantly vigilant. She was beginning to trust that he would not abandon them. He placed a hand gently on her shoulder, a silent acknowledgement of the bond forming between them. In that quiet cabin, surrounded by the sounds of the prairie and the warmth of a slowly rekindled fire, healing began in small, almost imperceptible ways. The girl's eyes grew brighter, her laughter soft and rare began to emerge, and the baby thrived in the security that was slowly becoming routine. The cowboy, too, felt a change within himself. The long years of solitude and emotional distance were giving way to something new, a deep and unexpected connection born of trust, care, and shared vulnerability. By the end of the week, a rhythm had settled over their small household. Healing had begun, not fully, not without lingering fears, but enough for the little girl to sleep without clutching the baby in panic, and enough for the cowboy to feel that he was no longer merely a solitary rider on the prairie. Together, they were beginning to form a family, one bound not by blood, but by trust, compassion, and the quiet courage to open their hearts to each other. The cabin was quiet in the early morning, with only the soft rustle of the wind through the nearby trees and the faint cooing of the baby breaking the silence. The cowboy sat on the porch, his elbows resting on his knees, staring into the distance where the golden prairie met the horizon. The last few days had been a whirlwind of care, attention, and small victories, but amid the growing sense of hope, shadows from his own past began to stir. He had spent so long hiding from them, burying memories under layers of solitude and stoic survival, yet now they crept back in, triggered by the innocence and hardship he saw mirrored in the little girl before him. He thought of a time long ago when he had loved fiercely, only to lose what mattered most. A woman, kind-hearted and full of life, had once been the center of his world. They had dreamed of a shared future, but fate or perhaps careless cruelty had torn her away from him. The memory of her laughter, the feel of her hand in his, and the quiet evenings they had spent under the stars came rushing back with vivid clarity. He had promised himself that he would never again open his heart, that loneliness was safer than loss. And yet, here he was, drawn inexplicably to a small girl and her infant charge, feeling the stirrings of protectiveness and care he thought he had long buried. The girl's hardships mirrored, in a subtle but piercing way, the pain he had carried for years. She had been forced to grow up too quickly, to shoulder responsibility that should have belonged to adults. She had faced neglect, fear, and abandonment, just as he had faced heartbreak and loss. In her eyes he saw the reflection of his own sorrow, the resilience that comes from surviving against harsh odds, the quiet strength that only emerges through repeated suffering, and the fragile hope that something or someone might offer protection and love once more. As he watched her through the cabin window, gently rocking the baby and humming a soft tune, he realized that helping them was not merely an act of kindness. It was an opportunity to confront his own past, to heal old wounds by offering the care he had once dreamed of giving someone else. Protecting this small, vulnerable pair was a way to reclaim a sense of purpose and redemption. He could not erase the pain he had endured, but he could channel it into something positive, something that might save lives and restore trust in a world that had often been cruel. Memories of his solitude on the prairie returned as well, the long rides through endless fields, the quiet nights by the fire, the way he had built walls around his heart to avoid disappointment. Those walls, once protective, now felt constrictive. The girl's trust in him, though still tentative, cracked open a space he had kept locked for years. Her dependence on him and the baby's innocent reliance stirred an unfamiliar sense of belonging. He realized that perhaps solitude had been a refuge, but connection, however challenging or risky, was what gave life meaning. He rose and entered the cabin, moving quietly so as not to disturb the girl or the baby. He knelt beside her and handed her a cup of warm water, watching her eyes light up with a small, genuine smile. "Thank you, mister," she whispered, the words carrying more weight than any he had heard in years. In that moment, the cowboy understood that their meeting was no coincidence. The hardships she endured had led her to him, and perhaps his past suffering had prepared him to meet her needs. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the cabin floor, he felt the first real sense of clarity in years. Shadows of the past could no longer hold him prisoner. Instead, they could guide him, reminding him of the lessons he had learned and the love he was now capable of giving. He resolved to protect the girl and the baby, not only because it was right, but because it was a chance for both of them, himself included, to find healing, trust, and the fragile hope that a new family could emerge from lives that had once known only hardship. The calm of the prairie had always been deceptive, and the cowboy knew that even in the quietest stretches of land, danger could emerge without warning. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, he noticed movement along the ridge that overlooked his cabin. At first, it was subtle, a glint of metal, a shadow passing through the tall grass, but as he squinted, the outline of 3 figures became clear. Strangers. Men, mounted on horses, their posture deliberate and menacing, moving with a purpose that set his instincts on high alert. The little girl, humming softly to the baby as she rocked it in her arms, noticed the change in his expression. "Mister, what is it?" she asked, her voice trembling, betraying the fragile calm she had begun to embrace in the cabin. The cowboy placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "Trouble," he said quietly, scanning the horizon. He didn't know yet who they were, but their intent was obvious. They had come looking for someone, and it was unlikely it would be a friendly visit. He remembered the stories the girl had shared, the nights spent running from strangers, the fear that had become a constant companion. And he realized that their pasts had converged into this single, urgent threat. These men could be bounty hunters, greedy townsfolk, or perhaps even those responsible for abandoning the girl and the baby. Whoever they were, the cowboy knew that the safety of the two children depended entirely on his vigilance and quick thinking. He ushered the girl and the baby into the back room of the cabin, placing a chair against the door and lowering the lantern so that its glow would not give away their position. The baby fussed slightly but quieted when the girl whispered reassuring words, her own fear tempered by a newfound trust in the cowboy. He could feel her clinging to him emotionally as well as physically, and the weight of responsibility pressed heavily on his shoulders. Every muscle in his body tightened, ready for the confrontation he hoped to avoid but could not. The first of the men called out from the ridge, a rough voice carrying across the field. "We know you're there, cowboy. Hand them over and no one gets hurt." The cowboy's jaw tightened. His mind raced through options he could attempt to flee, but the girl and baby were too small to move quickly and safely. He could try to negotiate, but these men were likely looking to exploit, not reason. No, the only choice was to stand his ground and protect them, no matter the risk. He whispered instructions to the girl, guiding her to stay low and keep the baby quiet, and then stepped outside, hands raised but eyes sharp, scanning the terrain. The men advanced, their horses kicking up clouds of dust. The cowboy's pulse quickened, but his mind remained focused. Every step, every movement had to be calculated. He would protect the children, but he also needed to outsmart the men who threatened their safety. Hours seemed to stretch as the standoff continued, the tension thick in the dry prairie air. But the cowboy's experience, honed over years of solitary survival, gave him an edge. He used the terrain to his advantage, positioning himself so that the ridge obscured his movements and allowed him to remain unseen. Meanwhile, the girl watched from the cabin window, the baby clutched tightly, and for the first time, she realized the cowboy was not just a caretaker, he was a protector, willing to face danger to ensure they remained safe. As night fell, the men began to retreat, frustrated by the cowboy's resilience and the impossibility of catching the small cabin's occupants unprepared. The threat had passed for now, but the encounter left a lasting impression. The girl clung to the cowboy in relief, her eyes wide, her small body trembling. The baby nestled against her, calm once more. The cowboy knew this was only the beginning. Outlaws, opportunists, and the cruel world beyond the prairie would continue to pose threats. But he also realized that together he, the girl, and the baby, they could face them. The bond they had begun to forge, strengthened in the crucible of danger, would become their shield against a world that had already shown them so much hardship. The morning after the standoff, the cowboy sat at his warm wooden table, leaning over a roughly sketched map of the surrounding territory. His hand rested on the map, tracing the familiar lines of the hills, the river bends, and the hidden paths he had memorized over years on the prairie. The previous night's encounter had reminded him that their safety could never be taken for granted. The girl and the baby were too vulnerable, and the world outside their small cabin was full of people who would not hesitate to exploit that vulnerability. It was time for a plan away to ensure their freedom, protection, and the chance for a better life. The girl watched him from the doorway, her eyes still wary but filled with curiosity. She clutched the baby tightly, aware that every decision now mattered for their survival. "Mister, what are you doing?" she asked softly. The cowboy looked up and gave a reassuring smile, though his mind was already racing with logistics and contingencies. "Thinking," he said simply, "we need to make sure nobody can find us. Not for good, not forever, but long enough to be safe." He explained to her the first steps. They would need to move carefully, using paths few knew, staying off the main roads and avoiding any towns where strangers might recognize them. Supplies would have to be gathered strategically, enough food, water, and essentials to last several days while they traveled. The baby's comfort and safety were paramount, meaning their journey would be slow and deliberate, taking only what could be carried without raising suspicion. The girl listened intently, absorbing every detail, her eyes widening as she began to understand that they were planning not just an escape, but a new beginning. The cowboy also considered contingencies for unexpected encounters. He had a small revolver, a hunting knife, and a few clever tricks learned from years of frontier life routes that allowed him to remain hidden, knowledge of natural shelters, and the ability to create distractions if necessary. Every move had to be deliberate. He could not rely solely on strength. They needed strategy, stealth, and a measure of luck. To reinforce their security, he set up simple yet effective measures around the cabin. The girl learned to create makeshift alarms, small bundles of twigs and cans that would alert them if anyone approached while they packed or moved supplies. He taught her how to identify natural hiding spots in the surrounding woods and how to move quietly without leaving telltale tracks. The lessons were practical, but they also carried an unspoken truth. She was capable, resilient, and could play an active role in her own protection. The cowboy could not and would not underestimate her strength. Over the next few days, the trio prepared meticulously. Supplies were gathered and packed into sturdy leather bags, the baby's needs carefully considered, and the girl's confidence steadily growing. She learned to trust the cowboy's judgment, and in return, he began to appreciate her instincts, her careful observations, and her unwavering protective love for the baby. Together, they became a team, an unlikely unit forged from necessity, trust, and shared determination. The night before their departure, the cowboy sat outside, gazing at the stars. The prairies stretched endlessly, a reminder of both freedom and danger. He knew the journey ahead would not be easy, but he felt a quiet confidence that they could overcome whatever lay ahead. For the first time in years, he was not alone, and for the first time in her young life, the girl felt that hope was real. As dawn approached, they would set out along the hidden paths he had mapped, leaving behind the cabin that had sheltered them, but carrying with them a newfound sense of security and purpose. The plan for freedom was more than survival. It was the beginning of a life where they could finally breathe without fear, and where the bonds they had forged could grow stronger in the face of uncertainty. The journey from the cabin was slow and deliberate. The cowboy led the girl and the baby along hidden trails, weaving through hills and sparse woods, avoiding the main roads that could bring unwanted eyes. The prairie stretched endlessly around them, a mix of golden grasses and distant mountains, and in its vastness there was a strange sense of freedom and vulnerability. For the first time, the little girl could walk without the constant fear of being discovered, and the cowboy could watch her with pride as she carefully carried the baby, navigating the uneven terrain with surprising confidence for someone so young. As they traveled, words became secondary. Communication was often through small gestures, a nod, a glance, a gentle hand on the shoulder. The cowboy would pause to point out safe paths, hidden water sources, or potential shelters. The girl learned to anticipate his movements, following quietly but deliberately, her trust growing with each step. The baby, nestled securely in her arms or in a sling across her chest, responded to the calm, steady rhythm of their progress, cooing softly when comforted and otherwise remaining peaceful. In those quiet moments, an unspoken bond began to form, delicate but unbreakable. Around the campfire at night, the connection deepened. The cowboy would sit on a log, the little girl resting beside him, the baby cradled in her lap. Words were minimal, often unnecessary. He would hum soft tunes, the same he had taught her in the cabin, while she hummed back gently. Sometimes the baby's tiny hands would reach for him, and he would respond with a gentle touch, a reminder that he was there, steady and reliable. In these simple exchanges, the bond grew beyond words, a silent understanding that they were a unit now, each responsible for the safety and comfort of the other. Shared hardships further solidified the connection. During a sudden prairie storm, the cowboy quickly set up a makeshift shelter, draping blankets and tarps to keep the children dry. He shielded them with his body from the whipping wind and cold rain, while the girl instinctively covered the baby as best she could. They huddled together, bodies pressed close, and in that physical closeness came an emotional reassurance. Fear, which had once dominated their lives, was now tempered by trust and mutual care. Even during moments of quiet, the bond manifested. The girl would occasionally glance up at the cowboy with a small, shy smile when he made a gentle joke or offered a comforting word. The cowboy, in turn, felt a warmth in his chest, a protective instinct intertwined with genuine affection. This was no longer simply about survival. It was about connection, about finding family in a world that had long denied them both. The baby's laughter or coos became a shared joy, a reminder that despite their hardships, there was room for tenderness and love. On one evening, as the sun dipped behind distant hills, painting the sky in deep shades of orange and purple, the cowboy watched the girl softly rocking the baby to sleep. He felt a quiet awe at her resilience and care. She had endured so much, yet here she was, nurturing another life with patience and courage. He realized that the bond they shared had transformed him. He was no longer merely a protector or a guardian. He was part of their lives in a way that mattered deeply, and in return, they had entered his life with a force he could not ignore. By the end of this journey, a subtle but profound truth had emerged. Love, trust, and family could be forged not through blood, but through shared experiences, protection, and care. The cowboy, the girl, and the baby had formed a bond beyond words, one built on unspoken understanding, mutual reliance, and the quiet recognition that each of them mattered to the others in ways that transcended their harsh pasts. It was a bond that promised strength for the challenges ahead and a foundation for the new life they were beginning together. The prairies stretched endlessly before them, bathed in the soft golden light of early morning. The cowboy, the little girl, and the baby moved slowly along a hidden trail, the world awakening around them. Birds called from the treetops, the wind whispered through the tall grasses, and the distant mountains stood like silent guardians. For the first time in their lives, the journey felt less like survival and more like a step toward a future filled with hope. Their trek had been long and cautious, each day bringing small victories. The girl had grown confident in her steps, carrying the baby with strength and care that amazed the cowboy. The baby had thrived, responding to the calm, steady presence of both their guardians. And the cowboy, once lonely and detached, had discovered a capacity for love, protection, and joy that he had long thought lost. Together, they had weathered danger, deprivation, and uncertainty, and now, a sense of peace settled over them that felt almost miraculous. They reached a small valley where a gentle creek flowed, sparkling in the sunlight. The cowboy stopped, letting the girl and baby rest under the shade of a sprawling oak tree. The baby giggled, splashing tiny fingers in the cool water, while the girl laughed softly, her voice carrying freely without the weight of fear. The cowboy watched, a rare smile tugging at his lips. In this moment, the hardships of the past seemed to fade, replaced by the promise of new beginnings, and the reassurance that they were safer now and perhaps for the long road ahead. He had been thinking about their future all along. The valley offered fertile ground, access to water, and shelter from the harsh winds. It was a place where they could build a modest home, plant small crops, and live away from the prying eyes of those who might wish them harm. For the first time, he envisioned a life not dictated by solitude or danger, but by stability, growth, and family. The girl, sensing his calm confidence, rested her head on his shoulder for a moment. The baby nestled between them, creating a quiet tableau of unity and trust. The cowboy set to work, gathering branches, rocks, and scraps of materials to reinforce a small shelter by the creek. The girl assisted eagerly, her hands nimble and determined, while the baby watched with wide, curious eyes. Each action, each shared effort, became a ritual of connection, a tangible reminder that they were no longer merely surviving, they were building a life together. Laughter and chatter filled the air, replacing the silence and tension that had once dominated their days. As night fell, they lit a small fire beside the shelter. The baby slept peacefully in the girl's lap, the flickering flames casting warm light on their faces. The cowboy sat close, placing a protective arm around both of them. For the first time, he felt a profound sense of belonging, a recognition that family was not always born from circumstance, but often formed in moments of trust, care, and shared hardship. Their bond, forged through fear, courage, and compassion, had become unbreakable. He looked out over the valley, imagining the seasons to come, the planting of crops, the growth of a small garden, the first steps of the baby as it learned to walk. The girl would continue to grow, not only in strength and skill, but in the knowledge that she was cherished, protected, and part of something enduring. And he, the once lonely cowboy, would find purpose in nurturing and safeguarding them, discovering that love could flourish even in the harshest landscapes. In that quiet valley, with the prairies stretching endlessly beyond, a new chapter had begun. Their pasts, filled with pain, loss, and solitude, had led them to this moment, a beginning defined not by hardship, but by hope, resilience, and the enduring power of connection. Together, they would face whatever the future held, united by trust, love, and the quiet certainty that they had found in one another a family worth protecting.